Let's travel back in time. Far, far back to an era that seems simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Imagine Earth encased in a sheet of ice, a world where gigantic glaciers, kilometers thick, crawl across entire continents, where colossal beasts roam the frozen steppes, and where our distant ancestors, huddled around a fire, carved their first tools from stone and bone, and gave birth to myths destined to fade into the dust of time. This was the Great Ice Age, a time that lasted millions of years and shaped the face of our planet as we know it today, leaving behind mysteries we are only just beginning to unravel. It's important to understand, an ice age isn't a single, endless winter. It's more like a giant seesaw, an eternal cycle in which harsh glacial periods alternate with brief, warm rests known as interglacials. Our planet's climate pulsated to the rhythm of tens of thousands of years, orchestrated by subtle cosmic rhythms, tiny shifts in Earth's orbit, barely perceptible changes in its axial tilt, and even a gentle rocking motion, like the spinning of a spinning top. These seemingly insignificant changes in solar heat were enough to reshape the entire world beyond recognition. Oceans retreated, exposing their seabeds. Land bridges arose between continents, and entire ecosystems ebbed and flowed like gigantic ocean tides, stretching over millennia. But let's leave dry science aside for now. Let's try to see this world with our own eyes. Let's transport ourselves to a place where, in the distant future, the cities of Northern Europe, America, or the endless expanses of Siberia will sprawl. The horizon is hidden from view here, and you stand on land that will one day become solid. But right now, there are no forests or megacities here. Before you rises a colossal wall of ice, woven from hundreds of ice blocks, compressed by time. This glacier stretches for thousands of kilometers, and its height reaches several hundred meters. The air here is prickly, dry, and filled with the incomparable scent of eternal snow. And yet, despite this piercing cold, the landscape is not dead. Look, herds of woolly mammoths move across these endless frozen-to-the-core plains. Their gigantic curved tusks dimly reflect the light of the low sun. Clumsy giant ground sloths slowly make their way across the earth, and death itself lurks in the withered grass. It is a saber-toothed cat. Its muscular body is strained to the limit, and its long, dagger-like fangs gleam like two ivory blades, ready for a deadly strike. Further south, far from this icy wasteland, where the rain of ice never retreats, life finds refuge. Here one can still find forests and full-flowing rivers. In these warmer lands, ancient people seek ways to survive. They migrate following herds of wild animals, hunting them with stone-tipped spears. And in the evenings, they gather around fires to escape the cold and tell each other stories. They, like all living beings of this era, treasure every bit of warmth this harsh world gives them. They have no idea that they live in a time that we, their descendants, will call the Ice Age. For them, it is not an era. For them, it is simply life. And here's what's astonishing. In this distant past, Earth wasn't a frozen globe, frozen from pole to pole. Yes, the northern latitudes were encased in ice, but closer to the equator, there was enough warmth to support dense jungles and hot deserts. Life didn't give up, it adapted and continued to evolve. During the Great Ice Age, our planet didn't just become colder, it became wilder, more contrasting, and, oddly enough, more vibrant. This epic saga began long before the first humans appeared on Earth. For millions of years, our planet oscillated between periods of cold and warmth, leaving their imprints in rock and soil layers. Scientists, like detectives, are piecing together this story, relying on clues found in ice cores, samples extracted from the deepest reaches of Antarctica and Greenland glaciers. Layer by layer, these ice cores reveal the secrets of the ancient world. Like time capsules, they preserve tiny bubbles of air from that era, allowing us to literally inhale the atmosphere that the planet breathed hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's thanks to these bubbles that we know the Ice Age didn't arrive overnight. It crept up slowly, the glaciers advancing, then retreating, then attacking again, like a giant tide grinding rocks into sand, then retreating, giving the Earth a brief respite. As they grew, glaciers reshaped the very topography of the land beneath them. They stripped away soil, transforming mountains into sharp, jagged peaks, and gouged out valleys, making them deeper and wider. Colossal boulders, trapped within the ice mass, were carried hundreds of kilometers and remained lying on the plains, like giant pebbles washed up on the shore after the icy sea finally retreated. Even today, if you hike in parts of Canada, Scandinavia, or the northern United States, you can still see these scars. Lakes carved by ice, distinctive U-shaped valleys testifying to the power of long-vanished glaciers, and rocks transported here hundreds of kilometers from their homelands. But it wasn't just the land that was transformed. The oceans, too, were changed beyond recognition. With gigantic volumes of water trapped in polar ice caps, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. Entire continents literally grew in size. Asia and North America, once separated by sea, were connected by a vast land bridge, which we now call Beringia. It was a veritable frozen highway, running where the waters of the Bering Strait now lap. This bridge had a colossal impact not only on geography, but on the entire history of life. It paved the way for people and animals to migrate between continents and disperse across the globe, a development that reverberates to this day. Imagine what it's like to stand on this bridge. A piercing wind whips across the open tundra covered in eternal snow. Herds of reindeer and mammoths move past you in endless lines, searching for the rare tufts of dry grass that miraculously survive in these inhumane conditions. Wolves stalk behind them at a respectful distance, their fur thickened by the bitter cold, and behind them all move small groups of people. Wrapped in furs, they slowly trudge forward. Their breath turns into clouds of steam, and every step brings them closer to a new, unknown world. It's astonishing how interconnected everything in this world was. As glaciers grew, the planet became drier, as most of its water was frozen. Deserts expanded, and once blessed tropical forests shrank, giving way to open spaces. Where once there was a sea of green, savannas now stretched for miles. Scientists call this vast ecosystem the Mammoth Steppe, which covered much of Europe, Asia, and North America. It was a harsh but teeming place, home to gigantic herds of herbivores, providing food for both predators and the early human hunters brave enough to follow them. But for all its grandeur, the Ice Age wasn't eternal. Every few tens of thousands of years or so, the ice would begin to melt, temperatures would rise, and the world would be transformed. The planet would once again become clothed in green. Rivers would overflow their banks, forests would reclaim their territory, and endless grasslands would shrink. However, even these warm periods didn't last forever. The glaciers would inexorably return, slowly but surely, and the world would once again sink into an icy slumber. It was during one of these warm intervals that humanity began to flourish. People learned to skillfully craft stone, create sharp blades, paint scenes from their lives on cave walls, and, eventually, emerged from the world of the Great Ice Age into the era we call history. And yet, the traces of that icy time have not disappeared without a trace. We see them not only in the Earth's landscape, but also in ourselves. Our migration routes, our ancient myths, even the biology of our bodies, all of these still retain echoes of that distant frozen era. To truly understand the world we live in today, we need to mentally return to that frozen world, see the movement of ice, feel the breath of giant beasts, and appreciate how diverse our world was long before it became what we know it as. So, let's take a step back in time to better understand the present. We continue our descent into the realm of cold. The wind is picking up, and the horizon is engulfed in snowy darkness. But this is only the beginning of our journey into the heart of the Ice Age, and many more amazing discoveries await us. The beginning. The cooling didn't descend upon the world suddenly. It spread across the planet in slow, almost invisible waves, so slow that it was impossible to notice any significant changes over the course of a single human lifetime. But on the scale of millennia, this transformation was inescapable. It all began with barely noticeable changes in celestial mechanics, minor fluctuations in the planet's orbit, tilt, and rotation. At first glance, this seems trivial. However, these almost invisible shifts altered the amount of sunlight reaching the northern latitudes of our planet. Gradually, summers became cooler, and snow, which had previously melted, now began to remain year-round. Over time, this perpetual snow cover, compacting, turned into ice. It's hard to imagine how different that world, teeming with life, was from what it has become. Before the onset of cold, most of the northern continents were covered in dense forests and lush green plains. Rivers flowed along their courses, and herds of animals grazed on lands we now know as lifeless, icy tundra. But as time passed, changes accumulated. Each new summer could no longer melt the snow that had fallen during the previous winter. Layer after layer, year after year, the snow compacted under its own weight, turning first into dense fern and then into true ice. Thus, the first glaciers were born, and once they began to move, they were unstoppable. These colossal ice sheets didn't just lie on the ground, they advanced like invincible armies, advancing centimeter by centimeter. At their peak, these glaciers were so massive that they covered vast territories, literally burying mountains and valleys beneath them. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet covered almost the entire continent, stretching from Canada to the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and moved south, reshaping the landscape under its crushing weight. Even the highest mountain ranges in South America and New Zealand acquired their own ice caps. As the world cooled, the very air changed. As so much water turned to ice, the oceans retreated, revealing vast tracts of land once hidden beneath the waves. Winds swept unimpeded over these newly formed plains. Imagine, this transformation affected the entire planetary system, altering global wind patterns and reshaping heat flows across the globe. And this was not some isolated, localized event. At the very edges of the retreating ice giants, other hidden lakes lurked, patiently awaiting their fateful hour. Some, like awakened monsters, burst forth with a frenzied fury. Their icy dams burst, unleashing colossal walls of seething water upon the landscape. Others, however, drained far more slowly, their calm outflow giving birth to new river systems, many of which still carve across continents to this day. Consider, for example, the Columbia River Gorge in the Pacific Northwest. Its majestic appearance was partially carved into the rock by just such a series of catastrophic glacial outbursts. These floods were of such apocalyptic proportions that they repeatedly tore into the earth, leaving behind a landscape of sheer cliffs and deep canyons, as if carved by the hand of some ancient titan. In Europe, absolutely similar, crushing forces were at work. As the ice slowly retreated north, meltwater accumulated in gigantic natural basins. These lakes eventually overflowed their banks, changing the courses of ancient rivers and carving entirely new paths across the continent. Even in vast Siberia, vast glaciated areas were submerged. Plains that today appear dry and lifeless were once the beds of colossal lakes. Incredible ice walls held them in place until one day they cracked and crumbled under incredible pressure. For people living in this constantly changing world, such floods must have seemed like the end of the world. It was both a terrifying and transformative experience. Camps and entire hunting grounds located on the shores of these temporary lakes could be wiped off the face of the earth in an instant. Valleys that had been teeming with game the day before would vanish beneath the roaring torrents of water the next. However, these same cataclysms left behind entirely new landscapes. They gave birth to fertile plains and created waterways that became lifelines for subsequent generations. Even those lakes that never broke free played a crucial role in changing the face of our planet. Some remain trapped in the gigantic scars left on the Earth by glaciers for centuries after their retreat. Their waters accumulated in deep depressions, awaiting their time to once again become part of the magnificent cycle of nature. Ice. Many of the Great Lakes we know today, Superior, Michigan, Huron, are living, vivid reminders of those titanic times. When the last remnants of the ice sheets finally melted, their gigantic basins filled with meltwater, and the number of lakes on the planet grew exponentially. These lakes were more than just geological formations. They became veritable reservoirs of life, feeding countless rivers and providing an ideal habitat for plants and animals slowly returning to the once frozen world. However, not all of these newborn bodies of water were permanent. Some proved to be mere temporary phantoms, born of the ice, and vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Their waters receded as soon as the ice dam holding them back melted. Other lakes gradually diminished in size. Their ancient, massive shorelines were left behind like faded memories, forever etched into the earth. For people of that era, these changes must have seemed unbelievable, as if the world itself were being remade before their eyes. One generation might grow up on the shores of a vast lake, its distant shores barely visible on the horizon. The next generation might discover endless, sunlit meadows in that very spot, or see a new river flowing where none had ever been before. Throughout human history, the Earth has been a living, breathing organism, constantly changing and requiring its inhabitants to continually adapt. These floods and hidden lakes were not only the end of an old world, but also the beginning of a new one. They carried away the last vestiges of the Ice Age and created the landscapes we know today. They shaped river valleys where future civilizations were destined to emerge. They left behind fertile plains, rich in the sediments of a bygone era. In both their furious, rapid movement and their subsequent silence, they marked the last, desperate struggle of the Ice Age, which was being replaced by a warmer, greener Earth. But even as the waters reshaped the continents, another, no less dramatic story was unfolding on land. The fate of the giants who had ruled this frozen world for so long lay in the hands of melting ice. The Pleistocene epoch was rapidly fading, and very soon, many of the creatures that had symbolized it were also lost to oblivion. As the glaciers retreated and the planet warmed, the great Ice Age animals faced a challenge they were unable to overcome. For tens of thousands of years, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats dominated their frigid world. They were perfectly adapted to life amidst icy winds and endless grassy steppes. However, with the end of the Ice Age, the very foundation of their existence began to crumble. The first blow came from the changing climate. As the ice sheets melted, the so-called mammoth steppe, a vast expanse of dry grass where herds of giants grazed in the thousands, began to shrink inexorably. In its place, forests advanced from south to north, their trees closing in on the once open and boundless expanses. For creatures born to the plains, this new, overgrown world proved a death trap. The grasses that had been their main food source disappeared beneath the dense canopy of foliage, replaced by plants that were either inedible or poisonous. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses could roam only as far as the encroaching forests blocked their path. Bison and wild horses, which had once roamed freely across entire continents, found their habitats fragmented into isolated pockets. And the predators whose survival depended on these vast herds, such as dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and cave lions, watched in horror as their food supply dried up. Gradually, link by link, the complex food web of the Ice Age began to unravel. However, climate wasn't the only force exerting pressure on these giants. At the same time, humans were spreading across the globe. Armed with tools honed over thousands of years and knowledge passed down from generation to generation, ancient hunters became a formidable force. A troop of humans, armed with stone-tipped spears, could successfully hunt down and subdue even a full-grown mammoth. what was once a rare and incredibly dangerous feat became commonplace, especially as human numbers increased and their hunting techniques improved. Some scientists suggest that the demise of the giants was the result not simply of hunting, but of a deadly combination of hunting and climate warming. It was a perfect storm. Large animals were already under enormous stress due to shrinking habitats and depleted food resources. When humans arrived in these areas, they simply pushed the already fragile balance to a tipping point from which there was no return. Evidence for this hypothesis can be found all over the world. In Siberia, for example, perfectly preserved frozen remains of mammoths were discovered, buried in permafrost. Some of the bodies bore wounds that could only have been inflicted by human weapons. In North America, entire butchering shops, the sites of mammoth deaths with clear signs of organized hunting, have been discovered at ancient human sites. Their bones were opened for nutritious marrow and the meat carefully trimmed from the skeleton. And these weren't isolated cases, but part of a larger, global pattern. They were part of a larger story that unfolded wherever humans and megafauna crossed paths. Although most of these giants disappeared from the face of the earth, some managed to hang on a little longer. On the remote Arctic island of Wrangel, a small, isolated population of mammoths persisted for several thousand years after their relatives had become extinct on the mainland. During this time of isolation, they shrank significantly in size, becoming dwarfed, weaker versions of their mighty ancestors. But even under these conditions, they managed to survive, cut off from the rest of the world by rising sea levels. Eventually, even these last mammoths disappeared, but their long existence remains a last, sad echo of a bygone era. The extinction didn't happen suddenly, but in waves, beginning in some regions and gradually spreading to others. In Australia, many huge marsupials disappeared long before the northern ice sheets began to melt. In North and South America, mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed predators persisted until global warming and human expansion reached a tipping point. By the time the Ice Age finally gave way to our current warm climate, the vast herds had vanished, leaving behind only bones and a deafening silence. This wave of extinctions changed the face of the Earth no less than the melting of the glaciers. With the disappearance of the giants, the entire ecosystem underwent colossal changes. Grasslands once trampled by herds of mammoths and bison gave way much more quickly to forests. Predators that had previously hunted large prey either died out or adapted to hunting smaller animals. Humans, no longer sharing the Earth with enormous monsters, found themselves in a much quieter and more desolate world. However, traces of that wild era remain with us. Muskox still survive in the harsh Arctic tundra, a living reminder of that time. Bison still roam the prairies in small herds, continuing the legacy of their mighty ancestors who survived such global upheavals. Many other species failed to do so. Even modern elephants retain mammoth genetic heritage in their DNA. However, those giants who once ruled the Earth during the Ice Age now exist only as frozen remains, fossilized bones, and dim memories of what this world was like. Their disappearance was not the end of history, but merely the beginning of a new era. With the retreat of the glaciers and the great beasts, the world began to change again, setting the stage for the emergence of a planet increasingly similar to the one we call home today. When the last of the great beasts vanished and the glaciers retreated for the last time, when the great ice sheets crept back toward the poles for the last time, the planet began to transform beyond recognition. Let's fast forward to that distant time. Anyone who witnessed the peak of the Ice Age would not recognize this new world emerging from beneath the ice. Imagine this scene: a lifeless frozen desert of ice and dust, battered by relentless winds, suddenly begins to come alive. Its harsh appearance softens. Razor-sharp peaks and ridges, carved by gigantic glaciers, slowly, century after century, give way to gentle, rounded hills. Mighty rivers, fed by meltwater, overflow their banks, The first forests sprout, and the earth changes its color before your eyes, from a dazzling white to a vibrant, rich green. This global warming wasn't instantaneous, but its effects were felt everywhere. The colossal ice sheets that had encased the northern continents for tens of millennia began their long retreat back to the poles. The lands freed from their oppression became wide valleys and endless plains, and the deep scars left on the planet by these ice giants filled with crystal-clear meltwater. Thus were born new lakes, true oases in the midst of a transforming world. Their shores were immediately covered with the first green fluff, the shoots of pioneer plants pushing their way toward the sun, boldly reclaiming the territories reclaimed from the ice. The endless mammoth steppes, where herds of giants once grazed, gradually began to yield ground to the encroaching forests. Birches and pines were the first to attack. They were hardy pioneers, able to survive in the poor soils and harsh conditions of the still chilly climate. Following them, as the climate became increasingly mild and predictable, came the broadleaf trees, mighty oaks and spreading elms, which confidently advanced north. In just a few millennia, entire regions that were once bare, windswept plains were transformed into impenetrable forest thickets. The open horizon of the Ice Age was hidden behind a dense green canopy, and along with the forest, new inhabitants arrived in these lands. Reindeer quickly colonized the thawed forests, giving rise to entirely new ecosystems and setting off a chain reaction of animal development. The shady thickets lured wild boar and a host of smaller animals, which found both shelter and food there. Even wolves, whose ancestors hunted vast herds in the open steppe, were forced to adapt. They became more stealthy, more cunning predators, true ghosts of the forest wilderness. As the world changed, so did humanity. Ancient hunters, no longer following the great migrations of mammoths and bison, mastered new survival skills. They learned to track more wary and swift forest game. It was then that bows and arrows appeared, a brilliant invention that allowed them to strike targets from a distance. Tools also changed. They were now designed not for open spaces, but for the shady, sheltered world beneath the trees. Rivers born from melting glaciers carried tons of fertile silt, transforming the valleys into veritable corridors of life. The water literally teemed with fish, and countless flocks of birds nested on the banks. Vast wetlands formed in the lowlands, pressed down by the weight of the retreating ice. Thus, glaciers, symbols of cold and death, paradoxically became the catalyst for an unprecedented flourishing of life. Where once a world of scarcity and the eternal struggle for survival reigned, abundance now reigned. Even the oceans were affected by the changes. Melting glaciers returned enormous volumes of water to the world's oceans, and coastlines began to inexorably retreat. Coastal plains, where ancient animals once grazed, were lost beneath the advancing waves. But in their place, new coastlines emerged, indented by bays and coves, home to myriad sea creatures. Where sea met land, ancient humans discovered rich habitats, learning to gather shellfish and fish. They adapted to this ever-changing world. But the transformation wasn't just happening on the surface. The very rhythm of the planet was changing. The Ice Age was a time of extremes, endless, harsh winters, and short, fierce summers. Now, with climate warming, the seasons became more harmonious and balanced. Springs became longer, summers milder, and winters, while still cold, were no longer so merciless. Life still required effort, but its pace became more fluid and opportunities became far greater. This fundamental shift opened the door to something entirely new in human history. For the first time in history, humans were able to settle in one place for long periods. They studied edible plants, hunted small game, and began to understand natural cycles. Slowly, step by step, they began to transform the land around them, clearing small patches of forest, experimenting with seeds, and planting the first useful plants. These tentative attempts became a prologue to a future in which humans not only took nature's gifts, but also learned to create them themselves. The planet's rebirth from glacial hibernation marked not just the end of an era, but also the foundation for our entire world. The forests that spread across Europe and Asia, the prairies that remained in the vast expanses of North America, the full-flowing rivers and new lakes, all of this became the backdrop for the great drama of the emergence of human civilization. It was on these green, fertile landscapes that the first farms, then villages, and ultimately great cities emerged. But even in this renewed green world, reminders of the glacial past remained everywhere. The Great Lakes of North America, carved out of the continent by gigantic glaciers, still serve as silent witnesses to the titanic force that reshaped the planet. Ice caps still crowned the poles. The wind still carried the finest dust from where ice had once ground rock to powder. And in the far north, in the endless tundra, permafrost still clung to the edges of the world, a pale echo of the era when ice reigned supreme. The planet hadn't simply recovered from the ice age, it had been completely rebuilt by it. Every valley and river, every fertile plain and dense forest that emerged after the great retreat of the ice was a direct legacy of that harsh era. From the icy scars, a world was born, ready for a new chapter in its history. And humanity, no longer just another species of nomadic hunters, stood on the threshold of its own era. But even when the Earth was covered in a green carpet, the memory of the Ice Age never faded. Its marks remained forever, imprinted in stone and soil, waiting for the day when someone could read and decipher them. Even after the last of the great glaciers retreated and the world was transformed, the legacy of the Ice Age never completely disappeared. Its traces surround us everywhere, imprinted in the Earth's memory, both on its surface and deep beneath it. Every valley carved by a glacier, every giant boulder dropped on a plain far from its native rocks, every layer of sediment compressed into stone. All these are silent reminders of a world that was once frozen under an endless sky full of snow and wind. The most obvious of these traces are the landforms themselves. Across North America and Europe, we see valleys that bear the unmistakable imprint of glaciers. Unlike rivers, which carve narrow, winding channels, ice acts like an inexorable bulldozer. It demolishes everything in its path, leaving behind wide, trough-shaped valleys with nearly vertical sides and flat bottoms. These landscapes are like the shadows of ancient ice sheets, silent but undeniable proof of their slow, crushing power. Lonely boulders scattered across the plains tell another part of this story. These glacial wanderers, some the size of small houses, were torn from the cliffs and traveled hundreds of kilometers, frozen into the ice masses. When the glaciers melted, these boulders remained where they had been when the thaw occurred, like monuments to a great journey that ended thousands of years before the first cities emerged. Lakes are also relics of an icy past. Great lakes like Lake Superior and Michigan, and countless smaller bodies of water across the northern hemisphere, were literally pressed into the Earth's crust by the monstrous weight of glaciers. As the ice retreated, these deep basins filled with meltwater, transforming into the freshwater giants we know today. Every ripple on their surface is a whisper, a reminder of a time when the world was frozen. Yet the deepest secrets of the Ice Age remain hidden from our eyes. Deep beneath the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica lie secrets that science is only just beginning to uncover. Ancient layers of ice, like time capsules, preserve air bubbles hundreds of thousands of years old. Scientists, drilling into this icy record, are extracting cores that, like the pages of an ancient book, tell us a remarkable story. Each layer of ice is a snapshot of a specific moment in time, preserving the composition of the atmosphere, the temperature, and even dust particles carried by winds that have long since died down. It is thanks to these frozen archives that we have learned how the Ice Age began, how it cycled through cold and warmth, and how ultimately its icy grip loosened. But it's not only ice that preserves memories of the past. Other traces can be found right beneath our feet. So-called loess plains are vast deposits of fine dust lifted by the wind from glaciers. They stretch across China, Europe, and North America. These thick layers of light, fertile soil were carried here by the winds of the Ice Age, and to this day they nourish the richest agricultural lands on the planet. Every crop grown in these fields is a silent legacy of the glaciers that once devastated these lands. Even the bones of Ice Age giants have survived to this day, recovered from permafrost and deep caves where they lain for millennia. In Siberia, perfectly preserved mammoths, Mammothus primigenius, are unearthed from the frozen ground, their fur and skin intact. In North America, the skeletons of mastodons and giant sloths are found buried in peat bogs, and in the caves of Europe lie the skulls and bones of cave lions and dire wolves, near which our ancestors' fires once burned. These remains are more than just fossils. They are a direct, unbreakable link to a world where everything was subject to the cold and the laws of survival. This story is carved in stone and sealed in ice, and it not only preserves memories of the past, but also serves as a reminder of how profoundly the Ice Age shaped our world today. Fertile soils, river valleys, and sculpted coastlines, all these unique landscapes were created during that distant, icy era. Even the spread of plants and animals across the continents was dictated by the slow, inexorable advance and retreat of great glaciers. Walk through these landscapes today, and you will take a true journey back in time to the era of colossal glaciers. Imagine a hiker walking along the very edge of a valley carved by ice, a farmer whose hands are immersed in the fertile soil left by ancient winds, or a scientist, trembling, clutching a fragment of woolly mammoth tusk. Each of them, without knowing it, is touching the same great saga. This is a narrative written not in ink on paper, but carved into rock, carved by meltwater, and preserved in fossilized bones. These traces of the past are more than just silent relics. They are clues, scattered pieces of a grand puzzle that humanity is still trying to piece together. Every valley mapped, every ice core extracted from the depths is another step in our quest, another attempt to unlock the secrets bequeathed to us by the ice giants. Each fossil find helps us understand more deeply not only the Ice Age itself, but also the powerful forces of nature that continue to shape our world and influence our lives to this day. Listening to these whispers, carried through the layers of rock and ice, we come to a startling discovery. The past has not disappeared. It is always close by, hidden in landscapes that we are accustomed to consider ordinary. The Ice Age ended many thousands of years ago, but its ghost still haunts our planet. Its traces can be found everywhere. Every time we look at a map, every time we step outside and see the gentle curves of a valley, the course of a river, or the bizarre shape of a coastline, we are, in essence, seeing the legacy of this world frozen in time. The planet we live on today is inextricably linked to the Ice Age. It is a world born from beneath the ice. The most majestic echoes of this phenomenon can be found in the Earth itself. The Great Lakes of North America, whose gigantic bowls were carved out by the unimaginable weight of glaciers, still contain a fifth of the world's fresh water. The rolling hills of New England and the vast plains of northern Europe are covered in a thick layer of glacial sediment. It is thanks to this dust and crushed rock left behind by retreating ice that the soils in these regions have become incredibly fertile. Even the meandering courses of many modern rivers were first carved across the planet by powerful streams of meltwater rushing from glaciers at the end of the Great Ice Age. And in the far north, the Ice Age seems to have no intention of abating. The vast tundra of Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada remains frozen for most of the year. Its permafrost is a gigantic natural crypt, concealing the remains of a world long gone. In this frozen ground lie the bones of mighty mammoths, and alongside them lie the seeds of ancient plants and even bacteria, dormant during the harshest days of the last Ice Age, biding their time. Our atmosphere, too, remembers that time. Carbon dioxide levels and the Earth's climate cycles themselves were largely determined by these periods of global freezing and thawing. These processes played a decisive role in shaping the climate we know today. Ocean currents and winds, the very systems that bring storms and rain across the globe, were profoundly influenced by gigantic ice sheets, which reshaped continents and, with their weight, altered the Earth's crust itself. Even now, our planet is still slowly recovering from the colossal ice mass that once pressed upon it. This process, which began thousands of years ago, has continued to this day. The legacy of the Ice Age has also left its mark on the animal kingdom. Mighty bison still graze the plains of North America, direct descendants of the very herds that once grazed alongside woolly mammoths. Muskoxen, shaggy and incredibly resilient creatures remain masters of the Arctic tundra, virtually unchanged since the time of their prehistoric ancestors. Each year, reindeer and caribou undertake their epic migrations across the northern lands, following not just instinct, but a genetic memory that is far older than all of recorded human history. This memory is rooted in an era of ice, cold, and piercing winds. Even within ourselves, echoes of those distant times still resonate. The great migrations of our ancestors were inextricably linked to the Ice Age world. Ancient people crossed land bridges exposed by falling sea levels, followed herds across the so-called mammoth steppe, and learned to survive in conditions so cold that they would instantly kill anyone unprepared. The skills humanity acquired during that harsh era, the ability to make and maintain fire, craft complex tools, and work together, didn't disappear with the melting ice. They became the foundation for all subsequent civilization. We see these skills in the landscapes we cultivate today, in the sources of our great rivers and the contours of our continents, in the animals that still roam the tundra, and in the bones buried deep beneath our feet. The Ice Age was more than just a historical epoch. It was the sculptor who sculpted our planet and, to a large extent, ourselves. But perhaps the most important reminder the Ice Age left us is how rapidly our world can change. In a geologically short time, entire ecosystems emerged and vanished without a trace. Seas advanced and retreated, and giants that once shook the earth with their tread sank forever into oblivion. Yet, despite all these catastrophic changes, life found a way to adapt, survive, and forge new paths for itself. That frozen world may have vanished from the face of the earth, but its story isn't over. It continues in the soil beneath our feet, in the fossils we find, and in the majestic landscapes that stretch around us. The Ice Age isn't just a chapter from the distant past, it's a prologue to our present, and when we turn away from these ancient echoes and look at the world around us, we can finally step back and take in the entire grand story of that frozen era, from the first frost to the last melting ice. If you could step back in time right now, step by step, to the very heart of the Ice Age, past modern forests and rivers, if you could transport yourself to that frozen world, the first thing you would notice would be the silence. The wind would still howl in your ears, and snow would continue to fall from the grey sky. But beneath it all, there would reign a deep, all-encompassing silence, the kind that only happens when time itself seems to stand still. You would see the horizon dissolve into endless, snow-covered plains where the sky seemed larger than the earth itself. You would observe the leisurely movement of a herd of mammoths slowly trudging along their ancient trails. Their breath would freeze in thick clouds of steam in the thin, frosty air. In the distance, herds of bison would stretch out like an endless living ribbon, and even further away, you could discern the dim silhouettes of predators, silent and endlessly patient hunters. The cold would penetrate to your bones, but the world itself would feel different. You would feel truly alive, in a way that is almost impossible in the modern world. This would be the planet in its pristine, unfiltered state. You could stop at the very edge of a glacier. Its wall would rise up like a frozen ocean cliff, offering a breathtaking view of the vast expanse. Blue ice, compressed over thousands of years, would reflect the dim rays of the sun, as if glowing from within. Water flowing over its surface would collect into thin streams, the beginnings of the very rivers that would one day carve their way across entire continents. And you would hear a low, drawn-out rumble, a reminder that even the mightiest walls of ice are never completely still. They seem to breathe, move, change, and eventually retreat. But if you turned your back on the ice wall and ventured deeper into the ice-free lands, you might discover traces of human life. A small cluster of huts, skillfully constructed from mammoth bones and stretched hides. A thin column of smoke would rise from a central hearth into the sky. That's what you would see. You would see trails of footprints in the snow, stone tools laid out for sharpening, and hunters returning with their catch. Their faces, weathered and sunburned, would look upon this frozen land not with wonder, but with deep knowledge. For them, this wasn't some distant and harsh past. This was their home. Walking through this world, you would see Earth in its truest, most pristine form. There were no cities, no roads, no walls, only wild nature, slowly and patiently creating everything around it over millennia. The Ice Age was no icy prison. It was a great teacher, a brilliant sculptor, and, in a way, the cradle of humanity. And though its icy breath is no longer felt so clearly, its presence has always been with us. The traces of glaciers are visible in the valleys and lakes they carved, in the soil that nourishes our crops, and in the animals that still inhabit the coldest corners of the planet. The Ice Age lives on in our own history, in the glow of our ancestors' fires, in the technologies they invented, and in the courage that allowed them to cross endless snowy wastes. If you ever find yourself outside on a quiet winter night, when the air is crystal clear and the world around you is still, you can almost feel it, a memory that isn't yours personally, but written in the stones beneath your feet and carried by the howling wind, a whisper of time itself. The Ice Age isn't just something we left behind. It's what shaped the very soil we walk on and shaped our lives. We live in a world where its history is forever etched into the landscape, and if you listen closely, you can detect its echoes, faint but constant, like the crunch of footsteps on ancient snow. And so we leave this harsh world, but we take a piece of it with us. Every glacier, every herd, every nomadic camp, everything our ancestors experienced has brought us to this day. The Ice Age is a thing of the past, but its saga lives on in the land and in us. When we look at the Earth today, we see rivers, hills, and serene skies. All this is the legacy of those times, and when we feel the chill of the winter wind on our faces, we touch something incredibly ancient, a faint echo of a world where survival was the only meaning of existence. We now live in a different era, an era of warmth and global change, but we have been shaped by what came before, and perhaps by recognizing this, we can better understand our own place in this grand story, not as something separate from it, but as its direct continuation. The Ice Age never truly ended. It simply changed form, becoming a part of us. Icy winds swept across endless plains, raising clouds of dust and carrying them hundreds of kilometers away. In those immemorial times, when the world was encased in ice, glaciers reached truly unimaginable sizes. They covered entire continents, leaving behind multi-meter-thick sheets of compressed ice, traces of which are still found deep beneath the soil in parts of China and North America, including the Midwest. In this kingdom of aridity and perpetual wind, forests withered and retreated, giving way to endless meadows. The entire ecosystem slowly shifted south in a perpetual search for salutary warmth. But our planet is not a simple clockwork mechanism. Its climate has always been the result of a complex interplay of forces. And while changes in Earth's orbit triggered the coming changes, they were not the sole cause of the Great Ice Age. Powerful volcanic eruptions spewed millions of tons of ash and gas into the atmosphere, creating a dense curtain that blocked sunlight and further cooled the planet. The oceans also contributed. Their currents shifted, carrying heat into the depths and trapping it there. With each passing century, this cooling flywheel spun ever faster, until Earth transformed into a world radically different from what we know today. Yet, even in this cold, frozen world, life did not give up. It continued its great journey. Plants adapted to the harshest conditions, finding refuge at the very edges of gigantic glaciers, while hardy grasses carpeted vast plains. And following the plants, animals followed. Imagine vast herds of woolly mammoths and mastodons. Their thick fur and thick layer of blubber provided reliable protection from the merciless winds as these giants trudged across the tundra. Bison, musk oxen, and reindeer grazed in open spaces stretching to the horizon. Predators also thrived in this harsh world. Saber-toothed cats lurked like ghosts in the tall grass, and packs of ferocious wolves tirelessly stalked the herds across the snow crust. But giants weren't the only ones who survived in these conditions. Nimble foxes scurried between snowdrifts, birds migrated along ancient, well-worn routes, and rodents dug entire underground cities in the frozen ground. Every living creature found its niche, creating a unique world where the laws of survival were incredibly cruel, yet absolutely fair. Humans would appear on this world much later, but even before their arrival, ice was already the dominant force shaping this amazing ecosystem. The Great Ice Age left an indelible scar on the planet. As glaciers grew and moved, they gouged deep furrows in the earth, crushing rock and grinding it into fine dust. And when the ice retreated, it left behind a completely new, transformed landscape, with intricately dotted lakes and rivers born from meltwater. In some places, the glacier left behind colossal piles of rocks and gravel, mute testament to its long, slow march. These changes were more than just a change of scenery. They became the foundation of the world we walk on today. In many ways, it was a time of both devastating fury and absolute silence. The glaciers moved with inexorable, all-consuming force, yet their progress was so slow that it seemed almost imperceptible on the scale of a single human lifetime. Mountains buckled under their incredible weight, and an ancient animal could live its entire life in the shadow of this icy giant without ever noticing it move a centimeter. This is the scale of deep time on which Earth's great drama unfolds, a process that occurs too slowly for a single human to observe, yet leaves traces that last for millions of years. This is the birth of glaciers. If one could transport oneself to the edge of one of these ancient ice fields, one could literally feel its presence, not as we sense a storm or a sudden gust of wind, but through a quiet, oppressive heaviness in the air, the barely audible groan of shifting ice and the endless stillness of the frozen horizon. The sky overhead would be pale and dry, the sun would hang low, and the earth would seem silent, if not for the distant cracking of the ice as it slowly but inexorably creeps forward. But this was only the beginning. As time passed, the cold grew ever more intense, the glaciers grew, and the world entered one of the most dramatic periods in its history. Yet this frozen planet was not dead. It was changing, shaping the land, the seas, and ultimately the destiny of all life. And the people who one day learned to survive in these conditions would become an integral part of it. And so the stage was set, a planet waiting for its moment, an Earth encased in ice. This landscape was shaped by forces so great they were impossible to see. A world where survival demanded adaptations no creature had ever encountered before. It was from this frozen era that the history of the Ice Age began, one slow step after another. When ice ruled the world, it wasn't just the land that seemed vast. The creatures that walked it were unlike anything alive today. It was an age of giants, born of the planet's harsh conditions. Vast herds of animals inhabited a world at once merciless and majestic, where sheer size was the primary strategy for survival. To find yourself in this world was to feel like a speck of dust, no matter who you were. Imagine an endless plain, swept by icy winds but brimming with movement. Long columns of thickly furred mammoths march. Their shaggy fur sways in the wind like heavy curtains, and their gigantic, curved tusks plow the snow with furious force in search of withered grass. and these weren't rare individuals, but entire clans gathering by the rivers. Their numbers sometimes reached tens, even hundreds. They roamed the steppes in search of food, leaving behind deep trails that stretched for many kilometers. Mastodons roamed alongside them, stockier, more squat relatives of mammoths, with short legs and straight tusks ideal for stripping bark and branches. They tore down trees with unwavering determination, moving from one grove to another, but mammoths and mastodons were only part of this frozen parade. The meadows teemed with herds of ancient bison, their powerful shoulders and thick coats protecting them from the piercing wind. Musk oxen, short and broad-shouldered, huddled in tight groups, instantly forming impenetrable defensive circles when predators approached. Reindeer, the ancestors of modern caribou, migrated in an endless stream. The clatter of their hooves on the frozen ground sounded like an ancient rhythm, as eternal as the glaciers themselves, and predators followed close behind. Dire wolves, far larger and stronger than their modern descendants, prowled the outskirts of the herds. Their jaws were designed to crush bones. Saber-toothed cats, with their long, curved, dagger-like fangs, hid among the sparse brush, ready at any moment to pounce on prey many times their size. Even cave lions, more slender but almost twice as heavy as modern lions, roamed the glacial slopes, hunting in coordinated prides capable of taking down even the largest beast. But the most impressive element of this harsh world were the glaciers themselves. These gigantic rivers of ice towered on the horizon like frozen walls. Their translucent slopes were cut with deep blue cracks. They moved unbearably slowly, but their presence was felt everywhere. The air around them was chilling, penetrating even the thickest fur to the bone. Every crack of shifting ice echoed for miles, a deep, guttural sound that reminded every living thing of a force beyond its control. Yet, despite their might, glaciers were not static. They advanced and retreated, crushing continents beneath them, stripping away soil, and changing the very face of the world. Where they passed, only bare rock remained, polished clean by their slow and relentless movement. They carved valleys that later filled with water, turning into rivers and lakes. They created cliffs and ridges that defined the migration routes of animals, pushing them into new lands and simultaneously creating new opportunities for the predators that hunted them. In the shadow of these icy giants, life continued to evolve, adapting to conditions that today seem almost impossible to us. Many of these amazing Ice Age animals had thick layers of fat beneath their skin, protecting them from the bitter cold. Their fur wasn't just thick, it was composed of fine hairs that trapped heat close to the skin. Even their blood differed from that of modern animals. Some species developed the ability to distribute heat more efficiently throughout their bodies, helping them keep their extremities warm even in the harshest temperatures. People also learned to live alongside these giants. For our ancestors, living alongside mammoths was not only a source of mortal danger, but also a true salvation. Their enormous bones served as frames for shelters, their durable hides were used to make warm clothing, and their high-calorie meat allowed small groups of hunters to survive in a world where food was always scarce, and the nights were long and icy. Yet the true scale of the Ice Age world would seem simply staggering if we could see its full splendor. It dwarfed any modern ecosystem. A single glacier could stretch for hundreds of miles. It could take a herd of mammoths days to travel from one horizon to the other. Even the sky seemed larger, its pale light reflecting off endless fields of snow and ice. This world wasn't designed for comfort, it demanded resilience, and in response, it gave birth to creatures, both human and animal, who evolved into extraordinary survivors, possessing astonishing resilience. Standing there, on that cold, windswept earth, one could see our planet at its most vivid and brutal. The air was so sharp, it burned the lungs. The sound of shifting glaciers in the distance resembled either the rumble of a distant thunderstorm or the groans of an ancient beast awakening from slumber. And on the horizon, an incredible spectacle unfolded, animals the size of houses, slowly moving in leisurely columns. Every detail of this world spoke of a planet transformed by forces beyond anything we can imagine. Let us be transported to a world where the very air seemed to obey the will of a single being. And yet, within this primordial chaos, there was a harmony, a delicate balance. Ice sheets sometimes clasped the world in their embrace, sometimes loosened their grip. The titans of the Ice Age rose to the top of the food chain and just as swiftly fell into the abyss of oblivion. When the food supply was depleted, animals either became ruthless hunters or vanished forever beneath the shroud of eternal snow. Life continued not because it had conquered the cold, but because it had learned to exist within its icy heart. The planet endured millennia of glaciation, and this equilibrium was severely tested again and again. The climate was unstable. The ice retreated, giving way to warmer temperatures, but then inevitably returned with renewed vigor. Animals were forced to migrate, adapt to new conditions, or die out. And somewhere amid this elemental chaos, our distant ancestors, the first humans, learned to survive, observing this slow, majestic dance of the Earth and its icebound giants. Now, as we delve into the depths of this frozen past, let's focus on the very engine that drove this entire vast system. We'll explore the strange, intricate climate cycles of our planet and how their changes affected every living thing. Everything was in flux. The cold was never absolute or constant. Even at the height of the Ice Age, the Earth wasn't forever encased in a shell of ice. It breathed, and each inhalation and exhalation lasted tens of thousands of years. Over millions of years, global temperatures shifted like a slow, inexorable tide. With each new cycle, glaciers advanced and retreated, transforming the face of the planet beyond recognition and dictating the survival of those who depended on them. To understand this world, it's not enough to simply imagine a planet covered in a blanket of snow. We must see how this blanket moves, how the cold intensifies and then subsides, and how these global changes forge the very history of the Ice Age. At the heart of these changes were cycles that we can still observe today. Scientists have named them Milankovitch cycles in honor of the eminent mathematician who first unraveled their complex patterns. The cause of these cycles lies in the Earth's motion around the Sun. It's not simply a perfect circle, but a leisurely, majestic waltz that stretches out over tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Our planet's orbit is not a perfect circle, but rather an ellipse, which over the centuries sometimes stretches, becoming an oval, and then contracts again, tending toward a circle. The Earth's axis also doesn't stand still. It's tilted, and this angle is constantly changing. Like a spinning top that begins to lose speed, our planet undergoes subtle oscillations that affect climate. As the Earth slows its rotation, the way sunlight falls on different parts of the world also changes. Each of these changes occurs so slowly that a human being cannot notice them in their short lifetime. But taken together over millennia, they have a colossal impact on the entire planet. When the tilt of the Earth's axis decreases, summers in the northern hemisphere become cooler. The snow that fell in winter no longer has time to melt completely. It accumulates, and year after year, glaciers begin to grow. But when the tilt increases, summers become hotter and sunnier. More snow melts, and the ice sheets begin to retreat. This delicate and inexorable balance creates a stunning dynamic, capable of turning the entire world upside down. Over long eons, the planet swings on this seesaw, switching from cold to warm and back again. However, orbital changes alone are not enough to explain the full force of an ice age. Earth's climate is a complex feedback system, where even the slightest change triggers a chain reaction. Imagine a giant mirror. As glaciers expand, they transform entire continents into mirrors, reflecting sunlight back into space, which in turn further cools the planet. The colder it gets, the more moisture freezes, leaving the oceans. As the oceans cool, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse effect. This, in turn, leads to further cooling and even greater ice expansion. It takes millennia to set this chain reaction in motion and even longer to reverse it. But this mechanism works both ways. When the Earth, for whatever reason, begins to warm, the reverse process is triggered. The ice melts, revealing dark land and water surfaces, which, unlike white snow, absorb more heat. The oceans warm and release accumulated carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, amplifying the greenhouse effect. Thus, the pendulum swings back and the glaciers begin their great retreat. The planet doesn't simply enter or exit an ice age. It constantly oscillates between these two states, like a giant pendulum. This process, though predictable in its scale, has been incredibly colossal in its consequences. Even within these great cycles, smaller, more drastic fluctuations occurred. Sudden waves of cold or heat swept across the planet's surface. The Ice Age world was woven with changes. Some were caused by the oceans, as powerful currents reversed, redistributing heat between the equator and the poles. Others were the result of catastrophic volcanic eruptions that spewed millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the sky, blocking out the sun for years. At the edges of gigantic ice sheets, vast lakes sometimes formed, trapped by walls of frozen water. When these ice dams gave way under the pressure and collapsed, they triggered floods so massive that they reshaped coastlines and possibly affected the climate for centuries. To experience these changes was to witness the world slowly losing its balance and then, centuries later, regaining its peace. For the animals that inhabited the endless steppes and sparse forests, this meant constant movement, an eternal pursuit of life. Herds of mammoths and ancient bison migrated south when the cold became unbearable, only to return north as soon as the ice began to melt. And in their wake, predators followed relentlessly, always ready to pounce on those who strayed or weakened. People living in small bands of hunter-gatherers learned to read the signs of nature, predicting its patterns, following the changing seasons and the ever-shifting boundaries of cold. Glaciers have preserved a detailed record of these fluctuations. Each layer of ice is a page of history, sealed with tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped by falling snow and compressed by the weight of subsequent layers. When scientists drill into these ice masses, they seem to hear the breath of an ancient planet. They find traces of every advance and retreat of glaciers, witnessing sharp rises and falls in temperature. Within this frozen archive, like books stacked one on top of the other in an endless library, rests the entire history of the Ice Age. But it's one thing to read about this ancient rhythm, and quite another to try to imagine it. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, cold plain. Above you, a pale, indifferent sky swept by gusts of icy wind. Far to the north, like an impenetrable mountain range, rises a wall of ice. For centuries, it slowly but inexorably moves forward, mile after mile, invisibly invading your world. Then, after millennia, the air warms and the summers lengthen. Cracks run along the edge of the glacier, and meltwater, bursting from beneath the ice, forms new, turbulent rivers. The land, once buried beneath a kilometer of ice, is exposed, raw, wild, and for the first time in centuries, exposing its vastness to the sun. But the peace will not last forever. Soon the cold will return, and the ice wall will once again begin its long, destructive march south. This was the breath of the Ice Age, slow, but so powerful that it was capable of carving continents. It wasn't just a period of great cooling, but a long pulsating cycle that sometimes pushed life to its very limits, sometimes gave it respite. During this time, animals and people evolved and adapted, and Earth became the world we partly know today, though most of it has now disappeared forever beneath the warm rays of our sun. But the story of the Ice Age is more than just a tale of cold and warmth. It's also a story of a living world that developed its own unique characteristics in this frozen universe. While the climate created the harshest conditions, it was life, strange, massive, and incredibly resilient, that gave the Ice Age its unique character. A living world. Amid the perpetual cold and endless ice plains, Life didn't simply linger, waiting for warmth. It adapted, evolved, and found its place in one of the harshest periods in Earth's history. In the most difficult times our planet has ever known, survival wasn't just a matter of endurance. It required a complete transformation. From the tiniest insect hiding under the snow to the largest beasts that shook the frozen expanses with their tread. During the Ice Age, the Earth was not a lifeless desert. Life teemed just beneath the snow, hiding a whole world, as if created in miniature. Rodents dug intricate networks of burrows in the frozen tundra soil, sheltering from the cold beneath a layer of earth and frost. Lemmings and other small mammals formed the very basis of the food chain. The survival of the many predators that roamed the surface depended directly on their survival. These tiny creatures did not hibernate. Many remained active all winter, digging entire labyrinths of tunnels beneath the snow, invisible from the outside. Down there, the air was still, the temperature remained stable, and the snow dome above provided reliable protection from the fiercest winds. Above them, across the vast expanses, moved true giants with heavy measured strides. Woolly mammoths were clad in a double armor of fur, consisting of long, coarse hair and a dense layer of insulating undercoat. This allowed them to withstand the temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Their blood possessed special properties. It could deliver oxygen to tissues even in extremely low temperatures, protecting limbs from necrosis. Musk oxen also wore thick fur coats, so dense that snow falling on their backs didn't even melt. This was a sure sign that their bodies lost almost no precious heat. Predators were no less prepared for the harsh conditions. Ferocious direwolves and saber-toothed cats were built for strength and incredible endurance. Their powerful muscles allowed them to bring down large prey even in deep snow. Their thick fur and their wide snowshoe-like paws prevented them from sinking into the frozen ground during pursuit. Even colossal cave lions, Imagine a world where the cold itself was the sculptor, creating the most fearsome predators. The greatest cats to ever walk this planet were products of the Ice Age. Their bodies, leaner and more elongated than those of their modern descendants, rested on legs designed for one purpose: the endless, tireless pursuit of prey across the harsh, open spaces of the Ice Age. But life in this frozen kingdom relied on more than just predators. The plants that nourished this ecosystem were no less astonishing. At first glance, the Ice Age landscape might have appeared to be a lifeless, ice-bound desert. However, beneath the blanket of snow and during the short, stormy summers, incredibly resilient flora hid. Here lay the so-called mammoth steppe, a gigantic grassland carpet stretching from Europe to North America. These grasses, incredibly rich in nutrients, provided the ideal fuel for vast herds of herbivores, who were in a constant search for food to accumulate energy to survive the bitter cold. Among the grasses, one could see tough shrubs and dwarf willows, their branches literally spreading across the ground, sheltering from the merciless icy winds. These plants were true champions of survival in extreme conditions. They adapted to long months of polar night and cold, only to explode with vigorous growth during the brief periods of summer sun. Here, all living things were forced to react instantly to the slightest climate changes. Even the tiniest inhabitants of this world, insects, found their own ingenious ways to survive the icy hell. Some learned to produce natural antifreeze in their bodies, special proteins that protected their cells from crystallization and rupture in the cold. Others bet on the future, laying eggs that could survive the winter in deep freeze, like tiny time capsules, awaiting the brief warmth of summer to give birth to a new generation. Birds also adapted to these merciless conditions. Many species, of course, migrated south to escape the winter, but the most resilient remained. Their plumage was incredibly dense, and their metabolisms worked so fast that they could withstand even the most severe cold. The snowy owl, for example, patrolled the tundra year-round like a silent ghost, hunting lemmings and thriving in a world that would have been a death sentence for most creatures. And amidst all this magnificent survival, humans emerged. Physically, they were far more fragile than the Ice Age giants, but they had their own, far more powerful weapon: ingenuity. Early hunters and gatherers relied not on brute strength, but on their keen intellect. They learned to create clothing from stitched animal skins that clung tightly to the body, becoming a second skin and retaining precious warmth. Their dwellings were true engineering masterpieces, constructed from bones and hides. Giant mammoth ribs served as a sturdy frame for tents, which were covered with thick layers of animal skins, creating a reliable shelter from the wind and frost. But man's greatest ally was fire. It wasn't just a source of warmth, it was the heart of their survival. Fire allowed them to cook food, making it more nutritious, temper spearheads, and ward off predators in the impenetrable darkness of the long polar night. For these small human groups, life was a constant battle with the cold. Every step on the crunchy snow carried the risk of frostbite. Every day was a struggle against hunger, and a deadly predator could emerge from behind every snowdrift. Nevertheless, they survived. They learned to read nature's signs, following migrating herds of animals, using frozen rivers and coastlines as landmarks in the endless snowy expanses. From stone and bone, they crafted razor-sharp weapons capable of piercing the thick hide of a mammoth or woolly rhinoceros. Over time, their understanding of this icy world deepened to such an extent that they learned to live not in spite of the cold, but in harmony with it. What made this hidden web of life truly great was its delicate balance. Snow didn't just cover the land, it shaped it, dictated the rules of the game. Under its weight, species evolved, adapting to harsh realities but never giving in. Every adaptation, from the tiny tunnel dug by a vole under the snow to the mammoth's massive fat and wool insulation, was a brilliant response to the challenge of an environment that demanded everything but gave almost nothing in return. But this world was about more than just survival. It was about perpetual transformation. With each climate fluctuation, with each advance or retreat of gigantic glaciers, life itself changed beyond recognition. Species that thrived during icy ages sometimes succumbed to the warming temperatures and disappeared forever. Others took their place, occupying the vacated ecological niches. The Ice Age was not a static, frozen prison, but a dynamic era of great change. It was a harsh ordeal that forged incredible forms of life and behavior, echoes of which we see in nature to this day. Even today, in the Siberian tundra and beyond the Arctic Circle, ghosts of that ancient era can be seen. The muskox still stands proudly against the piercing wind, and the Arctic fox sheds its brown coat for a dazzling white, vanishing into the snow like a spirit from the past. These living relics remind us that the Ice Age did not vanish without a trace. It left behind a legacy, fragments of which are scattered across the planet. And while the glaciers advanced and retreated, while the cold intensified and then abated, this world hidden beneath the snow never ceased its eternal dance of life and death. New upheavals lay ahead, for the ice was preparing to change the very shape of the continents, to reshape the bones of the earth. Ice was never static. It flowed, shifting in the form of gigantic glaciers, a force so colossal and inexorable that it literally reshaped entire continents. When we imagine glaciers, we imagine silent, motionless walls of white. But in reality, these gigantic ice sheets were not monuments, but living, moving engines of change. With a patience unique to the planet itself, they slowly but surely ground, crushed, and transformed the land beneath them. The largest of these covered most of the world's northern regions. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the high Arctic to what is now the United States. In some places, its thickness was so incredible that its icy peak towered above the highest mountains. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and moved deep into northern Europe like a frozen continent-sized wave. Even in the southern hemisphere, in the mountains of South America, New Zealand, and parts of Antarctica, ice caps were far more extensive than they are today. These ice sheets were in perpetual motion. As they advanced, they tore away the soil, destroyed forests, raised hills, and ground rocks into fine stone powder. Under their monstrous weight, the very crust of the Earth buckled, sinking under the unimaginable strain. When the ice retreated, the scars left by its presence remained forever on the face of the planet. In some areas of Canada and Scandinavia, the land is still slowly rising, recovering from the removal of this icy burden. Glaciers left behind landscapes we easily recognize today. Deep, U-shaped valleys with flat floors and steep walls, carved by the relentless pressure of ice, can be found throughout the northern hemisphere. Enormous boulders, transported hundreds of kilometers from their rocky home, lie in the fields, silent witnesses to the incredible journeys they once made while trapped in ice. And, of course, lakes. Thousands of them fill the depressions carved by advancing glaciers. The Great Lakes of North America are perhaps the most spectacular example. These vast inland seas rest in the scars left by the retreating Laurentide ice sheet. But glaciers weren't just sculptors of the land, they were also masters of the ocean. As the ice caps grew, they drew water from the world's oceans, causing sea levels to drop catastrophically, exposing vast tracts of land. When the ice melted, the water returned, and the sea once again flooded the coastal plains. The land bridges that once connected continents, like the famous Bering Land Bridge between Asia and North America, existed only because a gigantic amount of water on the planet was locked in ice. Every glacial movement literally redrew the map of the world. Yet, despite their might, the glaciers moved agonizingly slowly, covering only a few meters a day. But this was enough to change the face of the continent over millennia. To stand before one of these glaciers was to gaze into the face of a force that seemed eternal, yet was in constant motion. At times, one could hear the deafening crack of shifting ice and the low, drawn-out groan of the frozen mass scraping against the ground. And when the meltwater accumulating beneath the glacier broke free, it lashed the land in floods of such magnitude that new river channels were carved out in a matter of days. These weren't rivers, but furious torrents, releasing energy pent up for centuries. But when the glaciers finally retreated, they left something unexpected behind. Despite all the destruction, they also created new opportunities for life. As they retreated, they left behind fresh soil, enriched with ground mineral dust. Pioneer plants quickly colonized these bare landscapes, taking root in the moist, fertile soil. Following them came animals, and after the animals came the first human hunters, tracking herds across the newly freed lands. These frozen giants also preserved history within their layers. Within the ice itself, scientists find bubbles of ancient air, ash from distant volcanic eruptions, and even pollen from plants that bloomed tens of thousands of years ago. Each layer is a page in the frozen chronicle of Earth, telling us not only how ice shaped land, but also how the planet itself breathed in time with the global climate. But for the creatures who lived during that era, glaciers weren't just history. They were the real, physical boundaries of the world. For mammoths and bison, the edge of a glacier was the edge of the world, an impenetrable wall of ice and cold. Even humans, with all their wits and determination, could only navigate these icy borders, following rivers and valleys where the land hadn't yet been swallowed by ice. As the ice sheets grew and melted at the slow pace of the planet, they mapped a world we still struggle to comprehend. Let's step back in time and look at the world we know today, but through the eyes of the Ice Age. Every hill you see in northern Europe, every crystal-clear lake scattered across the vast expanses of Canada, every inch of fertile land in the American Midwest, all these are scars left on the planet by giant glaciers. They weren't just blocks of frozen water. Imagine titanic sculptors tirelessly carving out a new face for the planet. But their influence wasn't limited to land alone. The seas, too, were transformed beyond recognition. With colossal volumes of water trapped in polar ice caps, the oceans, shackled by ice, began to slowly retreat. Coastlines shifted, revealing vast territories that had lain submerged for millennia beneath thick salt water. And it was on these newly born lands that life began to blossom. Animals arrived, followed by early humans, who, like all living things, instinctively sought new ways to survive and thrive. When ice sheets the size of entire continents covered the planet, they literally sucked the water from the world's oceans. Sea levels dropped as if a great tide had begun, not expected to return for thousands of years. Coastlines retreated, revealing vast plains hidden from sunlight for centuries beneath the waves. Mighty rivers, deprived of their familiar mouths, carved new winding paths through these uncharted lands, like arteries carrying life to the heart of a new world. Continents took on entirely new, unfamiliar shapes. The world of that era looked completely different, familiar in its general outlines, yet altered in ways that today seem surreal. Imagine this scene. At the peak of an ice age, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. That's the height of a 30-story building. But this drop wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but rather a slow, inexorable exhalation of the planet. A process that lasted for millennia as glaciers grew and strengthened, resulted in once shallow coastal areas emerging onto dry land. Where waves once lapped, windswept meadows now stretched. Sea bays and cozy coves became dry valleys. Islands, previously cut off from the world by water, connected to the mainland, creating grand land bridges between continents that are now separated by thousands of kilometers of open sea. The most famous of these bridges is Beringia, a colossal landmass that once connected Asia and North America. It was no mere isthmus, but an entire lost continent, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Endless expanses of frigid tundra and dry steppes cut by icy rivers became a new home for giant mammoths, mighty bison, and, of course, the first humans who one day set foot in the New World. For those brave souls who crossed Beringia, it was not just a journey, but a lifetime. They walked across a new land, rich in game and full of dangers, as real as any other part of the earth at that time. Further south, the sand shelf stretched out, connecting the islands of Southeast Asia into a single landmass. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania also merged into a single supercontinent. And in Europe, the North Sea floor dried up, forming a region paleontologists call Doggerland. It was a vast plain stretching between Britain and the rest of Europe, with rivers, hills, and a wealth of wildlife. These new lands didn't just change the map of the world, they rewrote the history of life itself. Animals rushed along these new corridors, migrating to places previously barred by the sea. And following the herds of game, humans followed. They developed new hunting grounds, gradually spreading across the planet and determining the future of our species. But the transformation wasn't limited to land. The retreating oceans radically altered the remaining coastline as well. Beaches stretched for miles. Where once were coastal cliffs, now towering cliffs rose, and coral reefs were exposed to the elements, becoming lifeless limestone cemeteries. As the water receded, the seas became more concentrated, colder and saltier. Ocean currents, those global climate drivers, shifted their routes in response to the new balance of water and ice. These changes, in turn, affected the entire planet's climate, helping to keep the world encased in ice. Even the air above the seas changed. As the oceans retreated, vast exposed tracts of continental shelf became colossal dust bowls. The fierce winds of the Ice Age picked up this fine dust and carried it thousands of kilometers. It settled on the land in a thick, fertile blanket that, millennia later, would become the basis for the richest agricultural lands on the planet. It was another stark reminder that the Ice Age was not simply an era of destruction and cold, but also a time of creation, laying the foundation for the world of the future. However, for a hunter living in that era, these monumental changes remained invisible. The sea didn't disappear overnight. He could spend his entire life following the trails blazed by his father and grandfather, never suspecting that somewhere out there, far beyond the horizon, the great ocean was retreating, giving way to land meter by meter, year after year. Changes became noticeable only on a generational scale. Rivers began to flow where grandfathers had once described sea bays. Herds grazed on lands that, according to legend, were once the ocean floor. And new horizons opened up only to those few brave souls who dared follow the herds into uncharted lands. While the ocean stood still, life thrived, adapting to the new realities. The coastlines became prime hunting grounds, and the river mouths became rich food sources for birds and fish. Humans learned to take advantage of these changes by following the animals that now grazed on the endless plains. In every corner of the world, the receding waters opened up not just dry land, but also new, incredible opportunities. But, like the glaciers themselves, the oceans could not remain in retreat forever. The pendulum swung back, the climate began to warm, and the ice giants began to tremble and melt. And then the seas would return. They would rise again to flood the lands that once belonged to them. Doggerland would sink to the bottom of the North Sea, the Bering Strait would disappear beneath the waves, and the world's coastlines would take on the appearance we know today. But that moment in history was still a long way off. At the height of the Ice Age, it seemed as if the oceans had frozen forever. The planet stood frozen in its icy splendor, trapped in the delicate balance between ice and sea that had sustained this world for millennia. And it was in this frozen world that great winds began to blow, raising clouds of dust into the sky and heralding the emergence of a powerful new force that would change everything. An ice age isn't just about cold. Along with the advance of glaciers and the drop in temperatures, the atmosphere itself changed. The skies of that era were heavy, leaden, saturated with eternal dust, and the winds seemed to never let up. The air was completely different then. The earth wasn't crystal clear and fresh as we might imagine. It was shrouded in a thin veil of dust, continually carried by the wind from continent to continent. This dusty haze made the sun appear as a dull, lifeless disk, and the sky was painted in pale, washed-out tones. This dust originated beneath glaciers. As the ice masses moved, they ground rock into flour like giant millstones. When the ice retreated or stopped at its edges, the wind picked up this rock dust and carried it away. It raced across the bare plains, lifting billions of tiny particles into the air and scattering them for hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. Each sandstorm was like an apocalypse, raising a cloud of dust that settled far, far from its source. In many parts of the world, these ancient deposits remain to this day. Scientists call them loess, and they cover vast swathes of China, Europe, and North America. In places, they reach tens of meters in thickness, a monument to the incessant dust storms that created these layers grain by grain. The winds of the Ice Age literally blew away particles of the planet, shaping new landscapes, and over time, these dusty plains would become some of the most fertile soils on Earth. But during the Ice Age itself, they were just part of an endless, harsh cycle. The climate that produced this dust was brutal and unpredictable. The enormous temperature difference between the ice caps to the north and the slightly warmer lands to the south created hurricane-force winds. These winds pierced every living thing, turning fresh snow into a hard crust and blowing away the last vestiges of warmth. They carried not only dust, but also snow, piling up gigantic drifts capable of burying entire landscapes. The Ice Age atmosphere was a world of extremes. Winters were unbearably long and brutal, with temperatures that dropped to levels most of us can't even imagine. Summers, though short, could be surprisingly hot in some regions, especially on the endless grasslands, where the sun was virtually unimpeded by clouds. This created a unique environment in which life had to constantly struggle and adapt. It had to be able to withstand deep freezing and then be reborn rapidly in brief moments of warmth and abundance. Volcanoes added chaos to this already turbulent sky. powerful eruptions spewed millions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and intensifying the cold for years to come. In ice cores extracted from the depths of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists find traces of these ancient eruptions. Thin dark streaks, capturing moments when the sky darkened, and glaciers seized the opportunity to advance even further south. Even the chemical composition of the air back then was different from ours. Carbon dioxide levels were much lower than they are today. Because of this, the atmosphere was colder and drier, especially near the giant ice sheets. Snow rarely fell in these regions, not because it was too cold, but because there simply wasn't enough moisture in the air. Paradoxically, at the height of the Ice Age, the icy heart of the world was often a cold, dry desert, its surface more likely to be swept clean by the wind than covered in fresh snow. For the animals that inhabited this harsh world, weather was more than just a backdrop. It dictated their every step, every movement. Vast herds of mammoths and bison wandered, following the shifting winds, seeking out areas where the snow had been blown away, revealing the sparse grass beneath, and predators followed in their wake. The survival of all these creatures depended directly on the vagaries of the weather. Let's fast forward tens of thousands of years to the harsh world of the Ice Age. Here, on the endless plains, ancient people learned to survive by reading the signs in the heavens. They watched the movement of the clouds and anticipated gusts of wind to discern when the weather would change and winter's icy grip would tighten. But the wind wasn't the only force that ruled this world. Dust, raised by hurricanes from distant glaciers, had its own dual consequences. On the one hand, it clouded the sky with a thick shroud and covered the earth in a grey shroud. But on the other, when the winds died down, this same dust brought with it the gift of life. Nutrients carried thousands of kilometers fertilized the frozen soil, transforming Ice Age meadows into unexpectedly rich pastures. It was a stunning paradox, an atmosphere filled with icy dust and piercing winds, and a land capable of supporting countless herds of giants. One of the greatest and quietest mysteries of the icy world. Imagine for a moment standing in the middle of one of these windswept plains. The horizon is lost in the endless, faded distance. The air stings your lungs with its icy grip, and the wind seems to never cease. In the distance, a translucent haze hangs over the land, a thin curtain of dust raised by storms hundreds of kilometers away. And above all this splendor, the sun shines dimly. Its rays barely reach the ground, but their warmth is not enough to warm and drive away the all-pervading cold. It was at such a moment that one could sense what it was like to exist beneath the skies of an ice age. Harsh, restless, yet strangely alive. This atmosphere, with all its dust and icy winds, was more than just a lifeless backdrop. It was a powerful force that shaped the face of the planet and all life on it. Currents of air carried with them the seeds of new, harsh life that blossomed below. And the grasslands, stretching from one end of the earth to the other, became the most recognizable feature of that era. It was an icy steppe, an arena where colossal creatures roamed, and the battle for survival unfolded across expanses as vast as the planet itself. A giant's stride. From Western Europe, across Siberia, and all the way to North America, stretched a ghost continent, a land whose parallels simply do not exist in the modern world. This was not the frozen tundra we know, nor the dense taiga forests, but something entirely different. Vast, windswept grasslands became home to some of the most majestic creatures in Earth's history. Scientists have given this world a name, the Mammoth Steppe, and it was the beating heart of the Ice Age. The Mammoth Steppe was truly gigantic, surpassing any modern biome on the planet. Its cold, dry air and short, cool summers may seem unbearable to us, but for the natives, these grasslands were a veritable paradise. It was a remarkably productive world. The ground was carpeted with dense carpets of tough, nutritious grasses, perfectly adapted to the short growing season. These plants didn't waste precious energy reaching for the sky like trees. Instead, they remained low-growing, clinging to the ground, where the fierce winds couldn't steal their warmth, and where they could cling tenaciously to the thin, dusty layer of soil left behind by retreating glaciers. It was this abundance of food that allowed giants to thrive. Herds of woolly mammoths, known as Mammuthus primigenius, roamed the steppe in countless numbers. They were everywhere, their enormous curved tusks plowed through snowdrifts in search of last year's grass. Steppe bison, or bison priscus, moved in a never-ending stream, their thick, heavy coats fluttering in the wind. Wild horses, stockier and more compact than their modern descendants, raced across the endless plains, huddled together in dense herds for protection. And among them could be seen true armored titans, wool rhinoceroses, Coelodonta antiquitatis. These massive animals, with their enormous horns on their faces, used them to break through the crust or fend off any predator that dared challenge them. The predators that inhabited the mammoth steppe were no less formidable. Packs of gigantic, ferocious wolves stalked herds of herbivores. Their impressive size and crushing jaws allowed them to hunt even the largest and most dangerous prey. Cave lions, almost twice the size of modern African lions, moved in coordinated prides, silently gliding along the edges of the meadows, biding their time. And of course, saber-toothed cats, masters of ambush hunting, able to wait for hours for the perfect moment to strike. Their deadly curved fangs were designed for one thing: to inflict deep, lightning-fast wounds. But life here wasn't limited to giants. Smaller creatures filled every available ecological niche. Lemmings and shrews scurried through the grass, creating their own microcosm, vibrant with energy and movement. Ground squirrels hid in a complex system of tunnels that threaded the frozen ground like an invisible web. Arctic foxes prowled the snow, scavenging the remains of larger predators' feasts or stalking the rodents that lived right under their paws. Even crows and vultures circled tirelessly in the cold sky, waiting for the moment to descend to the ground, where the snow was stained with the fresh blood of their next victim. And then humans entered this arena. They arrived in these lands later than other inhabitants, but once they arrived, they became an integral part of this world. The first hunters followed the herds across the open plains. They tracked mammoths and bison, meticulously studying their habits and honing their survival skills in the harsh conditions of the icy wilderness. They learned to build shelters from mammoth bones, covering them with the skins of the killed animals to protect themselves from the merciless wind. And they painted the creatures they hunted on the walls of deep caves. These ancient images convey a whole range of emotions, from admiration for their power to primal fear. It was a chronicle of survival. The mammoth steppe's uniqueness lay not only in its colossal size, but also in its astonishing resilience. For millennia, it remained a world apart, born of the cold, yet protected from its most destructive manifestations. The grasses endured the harsh winters without a problem, falling asleep under deep snow, only to be reborn with renewed vigor under the rays of the short summer sun. This eternal cycle, freezing and renewing, maintained the incredible vitality of this place. Even as the glaciers advanced and retreated, the edges of this world revealed its former richness. Mammoth remains are still found in the Siberian permafrost, so perfectly preserved that their fur still clings to their skins, and the herbs they ate before death can be found in their stomachs. These silent relics tell us the story of what this world was like, a place where life thrived, even in the shadow of gigantic glaciers, where the ground was hard as stone and the air dry and cold, and yet it was enough to feed the titans. Being in the midst of all this would have been a stunning experience. The horizon would stretch in all directions, unbroken by mountains or forests. The wind would sweep across the plains, carrying the soft sounds of distant herds and the shrill cries of predators on the hunt. Every living creature, from the tiniest rodent to the colossal mammoth, was part of a single perfectly tuned system that transformed grass and dust into flesh and blood on a scale almost unimaginable today. But this world, for all its power and resilience, was not eternal. Its very existence depended on a fragile balance and the reign of cold. As the climate began to change, as the glaciers melted and retreated north and forests took their place, the Great Steppe began to shrink. Its vast herds were forced to seek out the last islands of refuge, which grew smaller and smaller. And eventually, the giants' pastures became a memory, preserved only in fossils, frozen bones, and our legends. This is what unfolds before our eyes today. However, long before this day arrived, the mammoth steppe was one of the greatest natural spectacles the Earth has ever known. It was here that ancient humans honed their skills and forged their will to live. Here, the last great beasts of the Ice Age reigned. On these cold and dusty meadows, life itself learned patience and resilience, lessons whose echoes will resonate long after this great era itself has passed. And from this vast landscape, our journey takes us to the people who walked it. They were not just nomads, but true masters of survival. They braved a world of ice and wind and managed to call it home. Small bands of people migrated across the mammoth steppe and along the edges of glaciers, following the changing seasons. They were not masters of this frozen world, but they learned. In a land where fierce winds and piercing cold reigned supreme, they found a way to adapt. In a world ruled by giant beasts, survival required more than brute strength. It was impossible without knowledge, ingenuity, and, above all, the ability to adapt. The lives of these ancient people were completely subordinated to the dictates of cold. They built low, squat shelters to protect themselves from the wind, using whatever materials the earth could provide. In the treeless steppes, where wood was extremely rare, they turned to the remains of giants, the bones of mammoths. From these bones, they built sturdy frames, which they then covered with thick hides, creating huts capable of withstanding the fiercest winter storms. Inside, it was cramped but warm, and the darkness was dispelled by the glow of the only life force: fire. Fire was more than just a tool. It was the boundary between life and death. Families gathered around the hearth, wrapped in furs and reaching out their chilled hands for the saving warmth. Fire cooked their food, tempered their weapons, and warded off predators from the endless darkness of the glacial night. On the coldest nights, when the icy wind howled beyond the thin walls of their home, only the flickering flames offered a fragile sense of security. But fire alone was not enough. People learned to transform ordinary stone into deadly blades, scrapers, and spearheads sharp enough to pierce the thick hide of a mammoth or bison. They crafted tools from bone and antler, each tool designed with the innate precision necessary for survival. Hunting in this harsh world was a difficult task, requiring perfect teamwork. Small groups stalked their prey across open terrain, driving it into natural traps or lying in wait with spears at the ready. A single successful hunt could feed an entire tribe for weeks, but a failure could lead to starvation and death. Even as the world embraced the cold and the days grew shorter and harsher, the human spirit found a way to create. In the deep, silent sanctuaries of caves, sheltered from the howling winds of Europe and Asia, our ancestors left behind a legacy carved in stone and painted on the walls. A whole gallery of the prehistoric world unfolds before us: mighty mammoths, shaggy bison, swift horses, and countless other creatures that shared this harsh land with them. Take a look at the depictions of reindeer. They are executed with such astonishing precision, with such a knowledge of anatomy and habits, that it becomes clear the artist saw these animals not simply as prey, but as an integral part of his world. These rock paintings weren't just decorations for gloomy dwellings. They may have served as visual aids for young hunters, memory cards depicting key animal species, or even a form of magical ritual, a plea for the favor of the spirits and a successful hunt. They are irrefutable proof that even in a reality where every dawn began a new battle for existence, humans craved something more than mere survival. Warmth became a commodity, and clothing became a true armor against the cold. Armed with fine needles carved from bone, ancient artisans stitched together the skins of slain animals. Furs were layered on top of each other, creating a multi-layered defense capable of stopping even the most piercing icy wind. Boots insulated with tufts of dry grass and soft scraps of hide protected feet from fatal frostbite on the icy ground. Every detail of a wardrobe was the result of long experimentation, honed over generations. It was a slow but sure path, traversed through countless trials and errors, until finally man learned to withstand the elements, avoid freezing to death under the lash of snowstorms, and continue on his way. The Ice Age demanded constant ingenuity from humans. Every tool created, every shelter erected, every fire lit was a response to the era's greatest challenge: how to survive here and now. This was the evolution of intelligence occurring in real time. Gradually, step by step, people mastered the skills of living in conditions that would be a death sentence for any modern human without training. They became keen observers, studying the habits of animals, memorizing their seasonal migration routes and how they used the landscape. Man followed the giant herds as they wandered in search of new pastures. He drank from rivers born from the melting of gigantic glaciers and created meticulous maps of the world around him. Maps drawn not with ink, but with personal experience and observation. On long, dark nights, when the icy wind howled outside the walls of their bone and hide dwellings, people gathered around the fire. In the glow of the flames, they told stories. Their voices carried through the darkness, telling of great hunts, of deadly dangers lurking beyond the camp, and of the strange, vast, and terrifying world around them. These tales were more than mere entertainment. They were a living encyclopedia, a repository of knowledge, a way to pass on to the next generation the invaluable experience of survival in a world where the slightest miscalculation cost the highest price: life itself. But even in this harsh reality, there were moments of peace and warmth. Imagine this scene: a fire crackling softly in the hearth, and nearby, curled up under heavy furs, a child sleeps, snuggled close to its mother. The quiet murmur of adults' voices blends with the monotonous hum of the wind outside. In those distant times, the Ice Age had not yet reached its peak, but it had already become the greatest test of endurance for the human race. And it was here, in this harsh crucible, that a new species was forged, incredibly resilient, hardy, and capable of adapting to any conditions. And they weren't alone in this icy world. Other branches of humanity, like the Neanderthals, shared these inhospitable lands with them. They similarly battled the cold, built their own shelters, and hunted the same giant beasts. Perhaps their paths occasionally crossed. Some groups may have exchanged tools, while others joined forces for large hunts, leaving subtle traces of their interactions in Earth's history. In the dim light of the Ice Age sun, the line between simple survival and true innovation began to blur. The future of humanity was being born here, in the glow of campfires and the shadows of caves. This was not an era of great civilizations and bustling cities. It was a time of small, close-knit groups, bound by blood and a shared need dictated by the land itself. Every step they took on the frozen ground, every choice they made, every spark they struck in the snow to start a new fire, was part of a slow but steady march forward. Their strength lay in their quiet determination to survive and continue their kind in a world that seemed designed to destroy all life. The lights of their camps burned in the darkness, but the cold outside did not retreat. Ice still loomed menacingly on the horizon, and the wind continued to carry its icy song across the endless plains. But in these fragile islands of warmth, man did not simply survive. He prepared to change the world forever. The cold could not break him. It became the greatest test through which our ancestors took their first steps into the future. In the light of fires, accompanied by the wind beating against the walls of their shelters, people stopped simply enduring. They began to create, to change the world with the power of their minds and skilled hands. Every tool carved from stone, Every line etched on the cave walls was a step toward conquering the Ice Age, not just surviving it. Stone was their most reliable ally. In riverbeds and on rocky slopes, they found flint, striking it with precise measured blows to chip off razor-sharp flakes. The very first tools were primitive, simple flakes for scraping hides or butchering carcasses. But as centuries passed, generations passed, and their skill grew. Hunters learned to create long, narrow blades that could be securely attached to spear shafts. This transformed a simple stick into a formidable weapon, capable of piercing the thick hide of the largest animals of the era. Step by step, they mastered the crafting of bone and horn, shaping them into jagged points for harpoons and fishhooks. These were tools crafted not for brute force, but for precision. And these weapons were more than just a means of obtaining food. They were a testament to humanity's growing ability to think strategically, plan ahead, and envision solutions to problems before they arose. But tools weren't just for hunting. Stone scrapers, in skilled hands, transformed rough hides into soft, pliable leather, and bone awls made it possible to make holes in it. This allowed people to sew clothing that fit tightly, leaving no chance for the icy wind. In a world where hypothermia meant certain death, the ability to sew a warm jacket or a reliable pair of boots was no less valuable than mastery of a spear. And alongside these purely practical inventions, something entirely different, almost magical, emerged. Art. In the deepest, darkest corners of caves, where daylight never penetrated, people left messages destined to endure for millennia. Using natural pigments, ochre and charcoal, they imprinted images of mammoths, bison, and wild horses on stone. Some drawings were simple sketches, while others were entire panoramas depicting vast herds. These prehistoric frescoes were executed with such mastery that even today it seems as if the animal's muscles tensed in motion. And nearby are handprints pressed tightly against the cold stone. It's as if those ancient artists were reaching out to us through time, reminding us that they were here, they saw this world, and they wanted us to remember it. No one today can say with complete certainty why they did this. Were these images part of shamanic rituals, intended to ensure good luck on the hunt or appease the animal spirits on whom their lives depended? Or perhaps they were teaching aids for the young, object lessons, teaching them to recognize the tracks and habits of the animals they would hunt. Or perhaps it was much simpler, and this was simply a manifestation of a deeply human desire for creation, a need to create even when the world around them was hostile and cold. Around the same time, the first sculptures appeared, small figurines carved from bone or mammoth ivory. Some depicted animals, others people. The most famous of these are the so-called Paleolithic Venuses, stylized female figurines with exaggerated forms. Their precise purpose remains one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology, but they clearly demonstrate that the minds of ancient humans were preoccupied with more than just food and shelter. These were the first glimmers of symbolic thinking, proof that even in the shadow of gigantic glaciers, people felt the need to give their ideas material form. This same inquisitive mind also developed new strategies for life. Hunting evolved into a coordinated, collective effort. People learned to work in teams, driving herds of animals into traps or directly onto the spears of their fellow tribesmen hiding in ambush. They tracked migration routes to be in the right place at the right time, and they memorized a mental map of vast territories. Around the fire, they exchanged invaluable knowledge: how to best shape flint, how to sew waterproof seams, how to find the safest ford across a river swollen with meltwater. This knowledge was not written down, but it was not lost. Each skill was carefully passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, forming an unbreakable chain of survival stretching across the icy world. Even such a seemingly simple process as fire-making underwent a revolution. Ancient people learned not only to maintain a flame brought by a lightning strike, but to create one from scratch. By striking flint against a piece of pyrite, they struck sparks, igniting dry tinder and patiently fanning the smouldering embers into a steady, hot flame. Fire ceased to be a random gift of nature. It became their property, a technology they completely controlled, and this mastery formed the foundation of all their future development. But it was art that truly transformed their world. In the flickering torchlight, the cave walls seemed to come alive. They ceased to be mere cold stone and became a stage for myths, memories, and reflections. Here, surrounded by the dark red and black silhouettes of mammoths and bison, people could not only contemplate the world but also try to understand their place in it. They were no longer simply creatures trying to survive the Ice Age. They were beginning to understand it. In these quiet galleries, sheltered from wind and snow, the first outlines of what would one day become human culture were taking shape. Their tools grew ever sharper, their shelters ever more reliable, and their art. Step by step, mastering fire, humanity learned not only to survive in the icy hell, but to master it, transforming the bitter cold from a deadly enemy into a harsh but understandable neighbor. But let's not deceive ourselves. Even having learned to slightly shape the world to suit their needs, humans remained a tiny, barely noticeable part of it. Beyond the fragile circle of light from their fires, beyond the walls of dank caves, stretched endless, ice-bound steppes. And in these vast expanses, giant predators reigned supreme. To survive in this harsh, unforgiving environment, our ancestors had to share the land with these monsters. It wasn't just proximity, but a forced coexistence. Humans were hunters, but at the same time, they were just one of many inhabitants of this world, where every day was a battle for survival. The Great Ice Age wasn't just a time of brave warriors with stone spears. No, it was, first and foremost, an age of predators, forged by nature itself, by the cold itself, into perfect killing machines. Any excursion onto the snowy plains was accompanied by an oppressive sense of constant, invisible menace. It was as much a part of the landscape as the piercing wind and endless snow. And among these perfect killers, some of the most terrifying were saber-toothed cats, such as the Smilodon. Their incredibly long, curved fangs became a true symbol of the Ice Age's ferocity. These bone and enamel blades were crafted to penetrate deep into the flesh of the largest animals, inflicting fatal wounds. But these cats were far from graceful cheetahs. They were not born to run marathons. Their build was stocky, their legs short, but incredibly powerful. All their crushing force was concentrated in their massive shoulders and bull-like necks. They were masters of ambush, waiting for hours in dense thickets or on the steep slopes of river valleys. Utterly unnoticed, they waited until an unsuspecting steppe bison or young mammoth came within killing distance. The attack was like an explosion, lightning fast and utterly merciless. Their fangs daggers sank into the victim's neck before the latter had time to realize what had happened. But saber-toothed tigers weren't the only blood-curdling threat. Cave lions, Panthera spelaea, nearly twice the size of their modern African counterparts, roamed the vast expanses. Unlike saber-toothed cats, which often hunted alone, these giants likely worked together in prides. This teamwork gave them a colossal advantage, even when confronting the largest herbivores. Just imagine this scene: a pack of gigantic lions, like ghosts, fanning out across a snowy plain. Their golden fur practically blends with the pale light of the winter sun, and their enormous paws carry them silently across the frozen ground. Few creatures on the planet could withstand a coordinated attack by predators of such size and power. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. During the Ice Age, these lands were inhabited by dire wolves, Canis dirus, beasts far larger and stronger than any modern wolf. They formed huge packs, and their numbers were so great that they constituted one of the most deadly forces of the era. These wolves could stalk herds of reindeer or wild horses for dozens of kilometers, relentlessly chasing their prey to the point of exhaustion, until it dropped dead. For ancient people, these wolves weren't just competitors for food, they were the living embodiment of danger. Their drawn-out howls, echoing for miles across the icy wilderness, served as a constant reminder. In this world, where hunters lurk behind every snowdrift, you'll never be completely safe. Even smaller predators occupied their niche in this hierarchy of terror. The wolverine, for example, was a relatively small animal, yet incredibly ferocious and merciless. It was a scavenger, capable of single-handedly driving off prey animals many times its size. Nimble foxes constantly circled the outskirts of hunting grounds, waiting for the slightest opportunity to snatch a piece of meat. And high above the battlefield, birds of prey always circled, patiently biding their time to swoop down on the remains abandoned by the great predators of the Ice Age. Man was not the king of nature, he was a link in this food chain. Every time our ancestors ventured out of their shelters to hunt or gather, they entered a territory rife with mortal risk. One false step, one moment of inattention, and the hunter became the hunted. This constant, oppressive tension forced people to be extremely cautious, always moving in close-knit groups and stoking fires throughout the night. Fire was more than just a source of warmth, it was a signal to predators. The flickering light of a campfire seemed such a fragile barrier amid the all-consuming darkness, yet it was enough to keep most nocturnal killers at bay. The relationship between humans and predators was a complex interweaving of fear, rivalry, and perhaps even a peculiar respect. When ancient hunters tracked a herd of bison, they often found themselves following the fresh tracks of a pack of dire wolves. And when, while searching the area, they stumbled upon the carcass of a mammoth, they might well have discovered that a saber-toothed tiger had already made its meal. In such moments, survival depended not on brute force, but on composure and wisdom. It was essential to instinctively understand when to risk a fight, when it was better to retreat silently, and when to simply lie low and wait for the mighty predator to sate its satiation and move on. Over time, humans found ways to tip the scales in their favor. They perfected their stone-tipped spears, allowing them to strike from a safe distance. Fire became their greatest ally, a weapon that made even the boldest predators retreat. Gradually, humans ceased to be mere prey, desperately resisting. They became serious competitors that could no longer be discounted. However, this was not total dominance. Rather, it was a forced truce, a fragile coexistence in a gigantic arena where every living creature desperately fought for the same precious calories, meat and fat. Predators shaped human behavior just as they shaped the behavior of herds of deer. The need to constantly observe, to be on guard, to calculate every move ahead, all of this became part of human nature. And perhaps it is in the shadow of these great predators that we should seek the origins of our innate caution and capacity for self-discipline. Saber-toothed tigers and cave lions taught humanity crucial lessons. Chief among them was the value of teamwork. Alone, humans were weak and vulnerable, but when people gathered around their fires, armed with spears, fire, and a shared intelligence, they had a real chance of survival. The Ice Age was a merciless world, never forgetting the horrors lurking beyond the warm circle of firelight. The predators that inhabited this permafrost were a constant living reminder that survival was not a right, but a privilege to be earned daily. And yet, it was in this deadly world that humans honed not only their spears, but also their intellect, transforming themselves into something more than just another species climbing the evolutionary ladder. As great hunters prowled the snowy expanses and icy winds howled across the frozen plains, the stage was set for a great struggle, a struggle that would determine the fate of the giants who ruled this land, a struggle that would decide which species would survive this era and leave their mark on the planet's history. During the Great Ice Age, our planet was populated by truly incredible creatures. Everywhere you looked, you would see something astounding, completely unfamiliar, and likely far more formidable than anything that lives on Earth today. And we're not just talking about the well-known mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. Literally every continent, every ecosystem, was home to creatures seemingly sculpted from cold and wind. They seemed almost mythical, a reminder that the world back then was far wilder and more pristine. In the vast open grasslands, herds of giant woolly mammoths naturally took center stage, but alongside them grazed the living armored tanks of the Ice Age, wool rhinoceroses, known to science as Colodonta antiquitatis. Broad-shouldered and covered in thick brown fur, they sported two enormous horns, the front of which resembled a veritable spear. These beasts were so powerful that they could fend off virtually any predator. The steppes were also home to ancient bison, taller than a man at the shoulder, powerfully built, wild horses, and musk oxen, perfectly adapted to surviving in the harshest cold. Further south, where the glaciers retreated, giving way to temperate forests and plains, other giants reigned supreme. Mastodons, Mammoth americanum, reigned supreme in the dense undergrowth. These majestic creatures, distant relatives of mammoths, slowly made their way through the trees, peeling bark with their long, flexible trunks. They were slightly smaller than mammoths, but their strength was no less impressive. And just think of the giant ground sloths, such as Megatherium. The size of a small car, they thundered across the vast expanses of North and South America, tearing the earth with their enormous claws in search of roots and easily bending entire trees to reach succulent leaves. And, of course, where these slow-moving herbivorous giants lived, predators were never far away. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, the largest bear to ever live, roamed the plains of North America. Its disproportionately long legs allowed it to reach speeds that would have been the last thing seen by any creature unfortunate enough to catch its attention. In distant Australia, the world was no less strange and wondrous. Giant kangaroos with incredibly powerful legs shared the continent with marsupial lions, predators unlike anything else on Earth. Enormous flightless birds, significantly larger than modern ostriches, roamed the open spaces, and the rivers and swamps were home to gigantic reptiles whose armored bodies and powerful jaws seemed unchanged since the age of dinosaurs. Even the oceans preserved their Ice Age wonders. Sea levels were lower, opening up new hunting grounds along the coasts for both ancient humans and marine predators. Enormous marine mammals like the giant Steller's sea cow, a distant relative of the dugong, peacefully grazed on underwater seagrass meadows, while fearsome sharks still patrolled their domain in the deeper waters. Life during the Ice Age wasn't confined to land. It was a global, planet-wide ecosystem of giants. What made this world even more astonishing was the incredible population density of these animals. The so-called mammoth steppe and its surrounding areas were among the most productive ecosystems ever to exist on our planet. They supported an unimaginable number of herbivores and, correspondingly, a huge number of predators that preyed on them. By modern standards, it was a world where food was abundant. The harsh, cold, and dry conditions fostered the growth of nutritious grasses that stretched almost to the horizon. The vast expanses of the ancient continents stretched out like a gigantic stage for an eternal drama. Here, in this harsh world, a continuous spectacle unfolded. Vast herds wandered in search of food, with predators relentlessly following in their wake. And among these titans, humans lived, trying to find their place in this fragile natural balance. Hunting a mighty mammoth or a herd of wild bison was a deadly endeavor. Each such expedition could be their last, but the stakes were too high to retreat. Just one successful raid, and an entire tribe would have food for weeks, and their strong bones and warm hides became vital tools and reliable shelter from the icy wind. However, sharing the land with saber-toothed cats and cave lions meant constantly walking on a knife's edge. At any moment, a predator could challenge a human, and then the fight would be life or death. To survive in this kingdom of giants, one had to be more than just a hunter. One had to become a true connoisseur of nature, an attentive and insightful observer. Ancient humans closely studied the habits of every animal with which they shared this world. They learned to read the signs. A herd of bison huddled together, a sure sign of an approaching storm. They memorized the secret paths that woolly mammoths took to the juiciest pastures and spent hours watching predators stalk their prey. Any knowledge, even the slightest, here in this wild world meant the difference between life and death. Despite all the dangers, this era was a time of incredible abundance. Let's transport ourselves there. Imagine standing atop a rocky ridge with the Ice Age plains stretching below us. Before our eyes is a boundless ocean of withered grass, brimming with movement and life. Over there, mighty mammoths, like living mountains, carve a path through the deep snow. Vast herds of bison raise clouds of frosty steam, and wild horses stamp their hooves, snorting in the icy air. And if you look closely, you can discern in the distance the dark, squat silhouettes of predators, patiently and relentlessly following the herds, biding their time. And high in the sky, above this entire scene, vultures circle, their keen eyes missing no detail of the drama of life and death unfolding below. The world around us pulsates with life, vast, wild, and indomitable. But all this splendor was fragile, like thin ice. This entire ecosystem rested on a single pillar: cold. Gigantic glaciers and frost-bound rocks created this majestic world of giants. However, should the climate change, should the ice begin to retreat, this entire world was doomed to radical change. Forests would return and conquer the plains, rivers would overflow their banks and redraw the map of the continents, and the creatures that reigned supreme during the Ice Age would face a challenge they were not destined to overcome. But until then, this wild land was teeming with life. In the age of mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and giant sloths, humans honed their skills, their wits, and their will by observing these majestic creatures. They didn't just survive in the shadow of giants, they learned from them. And very soon, when the ice breaks, the relationship between humans and these massive animals will change so dramatically that it will forever alter the course of history. The end of the Ice Age wasn't like the flip of a switch, as is often portrayed. The world didn't wake up one morning to see the ice caps melt overnight. Instead, it was an excruciatingly long and uneven process. The retreat of the glaciers was a slow but inexorable event, stretching over tens of thousands of years. The planet gradually shifted its orbital position, and every change, even the slightest, had dramatic consequences for the land, the oceans, and all life on Earth. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. Summers grew slightly longer, and the snow that had previously lain year-round began to melt slightly more rapidly. The first to feel these changes were the glaciers, colossal rivers of ice. Their edges softened, and the first rivulets of meltwater ran across the surface, carving channels through the icy body, growing deeper and wider with each season. What had seemed eternal and motionless for millennia began to move with a new frightening force. The first meltwaters bit into the earth like sharp knives. Glacial rivers, bursting from beneath the ice cap, carried tons of silt and rocks, changing the contours of valleys and carving new paths. Where the ice blocked the water, giant lakes formed, but their lifespans were short-lived. Sooner or later, the ice dams gave way and catastrophic floods occurred. Each flood lashed the plains with uncontrollable fury, leaving deep scars on the planet that would be visible for millennia. As the glaciers retreated, they revealed land that hadn't seen sunlight for thousands of years. This damp, lifeless landscape was literally scraped clean by the colossal weight of the ice. But nature abhorred a vacuum and immediately began to reclaim the reclaimed territories. Mosses and lichens were the first to appear on the bare rocks. Grasses followed, their roots clinging to the fresh soil carried by the wind. Gradually, the barren grey earth was transformed, turning into new, young ecosystems. Green threads of life wove across the scars left by the retreating glacier. Following the plants, animals arrived. Vast herds of bison and mammoths moved north, exploring new lands. The animals migrated to newly opened plains, where succulent young shoots awaited them. And in their wake, predators followed, reclaiming their ancient hunting grounds, but in a completely different, constantly changing landscape. Humans, too, moved forward. People explored new rivers, hunted at the very edges of melting glaciers, and populated regions that had been buried under kilometers of ice for generations of their ancestors. However, the glacier's retreat was not linear. There were pauses and even reversals. Periods of warming could be followed by a sharp, sudden return of cold. There were moments when the ice would begin a rapid advance again, reclaiming lost ground. These cold spells were brief compared to the millennia-long cycles of the Ice Age, but for people and animals, they served as a stark reminder of nature's vastness, complexity, and unpredictability. It was then that one of the most dramatic turns in this story occurred. An event geologists would call the Younger Dryas. It was a sudden, violent return of winter, a true test of all life. Approximately 12,000 years ago, when it seemed the world was finally entering a warmer era, a new frost struck. It halted the melting of the glaciers and plunged most of the planet into a long, protracted winter. The unexpected freeze delayed the arrival of spring for more than 1,000 years. The grasslands dried up, and survival once again became a brutal struggle. Yet even this last, desperate gasp of the Ice Age eventually came to an end. As the cold finally loosened its icy grip, glaciers began retreating at an unprecedented rate. The oceans, fed by thousands of mighty rivers of meltwater, began to rise. Entire swathes of land sank beneath the waves, and land bridges that once connected continents were forever swallowed by the waves. Beringia, the vast tundra plain that linked Asia and North America, disappeared beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. Doggerland, once a rich hunting ground, also sank. The land between Britain and mainland Europe was inundated by the rising waters of the North Sea. As the world warmed, forests moved north, displacing the vast grasslands of the Mammoth Steppe. Trees overran Europe, Asia, and North America, transforming open plains into dense, shady thickets. Many Ice Age giants, creatures perfectly adapted to a world of cold and vast spaces, found themselves trapped in this rapidly changing world. Some were able to adapt, but most were doomed. But for humans, this transformation opened up new opportunities. As the glaciers retreated and the climate became more stable, they discovered lands rich in rivers, fertile soil, and new resources. They followed the meltwater trails, settled by lakes and in ice-cut valleys, and began the long journey of transforming from nomadic hunters into something entirely different. They became the first settlers of a new, warmer world. Even after humans adapted to life on this new land, the legacy of the glaciers remained in their memories, like deep furrows etched into the landscape. Valleys carved by the ice became riverbeds, and deposits of silt and rock laid the foundations for future fields and pastures. The retreat of the glaciers marked not just the end of an era of cold, but the birth of a new world. The Ice Age had not yet completely ended, but its backbone had been broken. Walls of ice that had once seemed eternal melted before our eyes, revealing new horizons. But the final great flood was still to come, and with it, the final transformation of the planet. As the glaciers retreated and the world warmed, the ice didn't simply melt, it literally exploded from within. Water accumulated in gigantic hidden reservoirs beneath and within the ice sheet, held in place only by fragile walls of frozen ice. And when this centuries-old mass, which had stood for millennia, gave way under the pressure, it seemed as if the entire Earth shook. These weren't just floods, these were monstrous torrents, capable of changing the face of the planet in a matter of days. In North America, the most striking example of this phenomenon was glacial Lake Agassiz, hidden beneath the Laurentide ice sheet. When the ice melted, it formed a colossal body of water, larger in area than all the Great Lakes combined. For centuries, this lake was trapped in an icy prison. But ice doesn't last forever. When its dams collapsed, the lake burst free in a torrent, the power of which would be beyond human comprehension. Water that had been pent up for centuries burst forth with unimaginable fury. It wasn't a torrent, but a moving wall of water that crashed onto the earth, wiping out entire valleys in a matter of hours. Rivers that had once been shallow and meandering became raging torrents several kilometers wide. These floods easily rolled boulders the size of houses, stripped soil to bedrock, and carved deep canyons into the earth. Pouring into the oceans, they dramatically raised sea levels, which, in turn, affected the climate of the entire planet. Each such flood was like a powerful shock that shook the entire world.